The White House says President Donald Trump is moving ahead with a tougher phase of pressure on Iran after weekend peace talks failed to produce a deal, even as U.S. officials insist a ceasefire is for now still intact. Speaking about the status of the truce, the president offered a blunt assessment of the battlefield and Iran's ability to keep fighting. He said, "I would say it's holding well." Then, in the same breath, he claimed Iran's conventional forces at sea have been devastated. Asterix, he said their military is destroyed. Their whole navy is underwater. Asterix, he went further, adding a specific number. He said, "You know that 158 ships are gone," and he argued that the campaign has also hit key elements of Iran's maritime disruption capability. He said most of their mine droppers are gone. The president also pointed to an imminent escalation in U.S. enforcement at sea, describing the start of a new operational posture meant to constrict Iranian maritime activists. Tie, Asterix. He said, "We have a lot of people, as you know, 10 o'clock, team blockade going into effect." Astic, the administration's public messaging has framed this as a decisive move to control access to Iranian ports and deny Tehran the ability to fund or resupply military operations through commercial shipping. In practical terms, the U.S. posture being discussed centers on a naval interdiction campaign around the Strait of Hormuz and the approaches to Iranian ports, a geography that matters not only to Iran but to the entire global energy market and to the economies of the Gulf. The central question is whether the United States is attempting to shut down the strait itself, or whether the operation is more narrowly focused on vessels traveling to and from Iranian ports while leaving other traffic lanes formally open. That distinction matters because the Strait of Hormuz is the choke point for energy exports from several U.S. partners in the region. A full closure would squeeze not only Iran, but also major exporters and importers, pushing the conflict's economic shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. A retired vice admiral and former deputy commander at U.S. Central Command argued that from a military planning perspective, the United States can effectively decide which ships get to conduct business with Iran, even if the strait remains technically navigable. The thrust of his argument was that interdiction does not require the U.S. to claim ownership of international waters, but rather to apply overwhelming force at sea and at key maritime nodes, creating a reality where shipping companies and governments calculate the risk and comply. He described the leverage this gives the president in the aftermath of failed talks, the ability to ratchet pressure up or down, isolate Tehran economically, and force choices on countries that continue to trade with Iran. The implicit message was that if the U.S. enforces an ironclad cordon around Iran's ports, nations that rely on Iran, oil or Iranian trade routes could be compelled to stop, either because their ships are turned back or because insurers and shippers refuse to operate under the threat of interdiction. In his view, the regional reaction to the White House approach has been far more supportive than many critics claim. He argued that governments closest to Iran's missile forces and proxy networks see the moment as an opportunity to reduce a long-standing threat, provided that any diplomatic outcome includes strict limits on Iran's strategic programs. He listed the core concerns as the same ones that have driven U.S.-Iran tensions for years: missiles, enrichment, and Tehran's relationships with armed groups across the region. But he framed them not as abstract policy arguments, but as immediate security fears for Gulf states that live within range of Iranian systems and have been targeted directly or indirectly by Iranian-aligned forces. The retired admiral's argument was that any negotiation that fails to lock down those elements merely buys Iran time. In his words, the worry is that Tehran could rebuild capabilities during talks or after a partial deal, returning later with the same arsenal and the same regional strategy, leaving U.S. partners exposed for longer. He also drew attention to what he described as the missing piece in the public negotiation framework, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. He portrayed the IRGC not as one institution among many, but as the central power broker in the Iranian system, both the engine behind external operations and an internal force used to control dissent. The reasoning, as he laid it out, is that Iran's most controversial programs are not simply bargaining chips. They are pillars of regime power. Remove those pillars, missile development, proxy financing, and the apparatus that projects force abroad and the structure of coercion at home weakens. That is why, he suggested, the IRGC has a vested interest in refusing terms that would dismantle those instruments. From that perspective, he argued that the United States has a pathway. If Tehran will not negotiate on those terms, then Washington should apply sustained, targeted pressure to the power centers responsible. He suggested a shift away from step-by-step diplomacy and toward coercive measures that force strategic decisions. This is where the debate turns from blockade mechanics to the question of escalation The conversation moved to reports, including from the Wall Street Journal, suggesting the administration has considered limited military strikes in Iran in addition to the blockade, the logic behind limited strikes as typically discussed in U.S. policy circles is to hit discrete targets, command nodes, missile sites, drone infrastructure, or IRGC facilities, while trying to avoid a broader war. But the risk is obvious. Even limited actions can prompt unpredictable retaliation and expand the conflict. Asked whether that kind of action would mash, Kay Sense, the retired admiral, argued the U.S. still has unexercised options. He pointed specifically to targeting the IRGC, noting that Israel has carried out IRGC-focused strikes in the past. In his view, concentrating on that force rather than broader national infrastructure would directly affect Iran's ability to sustain both external aggression and internal repression. He suggested that if U.S. capabilities are aligned with that objective, it could become a successful component of an overall strategy designed to produce what he called enduring stability. The underlying premise is that an enforceable peace requires more than a pause in fighting. It requires an Iranian posture that renounces the revolutionary export model and agrees to dismantle the systems that enable it. He described that as the key to a lasting settlement, not simply reopening shipping lanes, but establishing a regional environment where the threats that Gulf states fear, missile arsenals, proxy networks, and enrichment pathways, are verifiably rolled back. On the diplomatic front, the emerging U.S. demand list being discussed publicly is sweeping. The conversation referenced priorities such as restricting funds, stopping uranium enrichment, and cutting off support for armed surrogates. The implication is that compliance would be framed not as a final piece, but as the opening stage of any broader settlement. The discussion also referenced frozen Iranian funds with the view that financial pressure, whether through asset controls, sanctions enforcement, or maritime interdiction, remains central to the administration's leverage. The argument is that restricting cash flow limits Iran's ability to rebuild, pay partners, and reconstitute capabilities that have been degraded during the conflict. But the immediate news hook remains the same. Talks ended without an agreement, and U.S. military pressure is set to intensify at sea. The president's language signaled that he believes the United States is negotiating from a position of overwhelming advantage. His claims about Iranian naval losses and mine-laying capability were presented as evidence that Tehran's ability to threaten shipping has been sharply reduced. And his emphasis on the blockade's start time conveyed urgency, an operational line in the sand designed to force Tehran and the world to respond. At the same time, there is a strategic tightrope here. The United States wants to punish Iran and constrain its options without provoking a chain reaction that turns the Strait of Hormuz into a wider crisis zone. Even a targeted blockade of Iranian ports can have spillover effects, rerouted shipping, higher insurance costs, delayed cargoes, and panic in energy markets. That is why the question of who controls the strait is not just rhetorical. It's a question of whether the conflict remains bounded or whether it becomes a broader economic confrontation involving major importers and regional states whose own exports depend. On safe passage, the retired admiral's core message was that the region's U.S. partners, particularly in the Gulf, see Iran as an existential threat and are unlikely to welcome a peace process that leaves Tehran's strategic programs intact. In his telling, they want conditions that prevent Iran from regrouping, not a deal that pauses the war while leaving the hard problems for later. He insisted that reports suggesting Gulf states are reconsidering their relationship with Washington are wrong, and he framed the current moment as one in which regional capitals are aligned behind a tougher line, so long as the United States remains committed and uses the leverage it has created. As this next phase begins, the unanswered questions are stark: how aggressively the blockade will be enforced, how Tehran will respond if ships are stopped or turned away, and whether the White House will choose to add limited strikes to maritime pressure. For now, the administration's public posture is that the ceasefire is holding, the U.S. has the initiative, and the pressure campaign is escalating by design and on a clock.